Welcome back to the Art and Jennifer Show. We started our program by talking about racial profiling, something that my co-host Art Holiday has experienced, and some of my friends of color. Dr. Alex Del Carmen is an associate dean and professor of criminology, and is joining us to talk about a new book that he has out called Racial Profiling in Policing: Beyond the Basics. Dr. Del Carmen, thanks for joining Art and me.
Thanks for having me.
So your book is focused on racism in policing, specifically racial profiling. In case somebody needs a definition of racial profiling, how do you define it?
Well, there are multiple definitions out there, but the one that sort of seems to find consensus across the board is when, in the case of policing, it would be when a police officer simply singles you out based on your race, ethnicity, religious affiliation, or national origin versus any kind of crime, right? So the idea is that instead of it being a criminal, there's been a criminal reason as to why you're being pulled over, there are reasons related to your race or your ethnicity that seem to govern that officer's decision to take a police-initiated action.
For people who downplay the impact of racial profiling by law enforcement, you say what?
I say that it does take place. We have over 30,000 police agencies in the United States and over 1 million police officers in the streets at one time. And I would argue that a lot of police officers are honest, decent, hardworking people. But we do have individuals that have never belonged in law enforcement that unfortunately have gone through the training and are in fact carrying a weapon, carrying a badge, and they are in fact racist.
I want to tell our listeners that Dr. Del Carmen is a professor at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth, Texas. So you have a chapter in your book about lessons learned from the Texas racial profiling law. Can you tell us about that?
Right. So in Texas in 2001, we introduced what was called Senate Bill 1074, which was the original Texas racial profiling law. And that law was very basic in nature, but throughout the years, the legislators have introduced additional laws which are now currently in place. The most recent one 2 years ago, which was Sandra Bland, and it does require police departments throughout the state to report instances of where police officers stop someone, the nature of the stop, whether or not a search was conducted, and whether or not the search produced contraband, among other items. So currently in Texas, there's a pretty significant requirement in place across the state regarding the collection of data. And
can you refresh our listeners' memories about Sandra Bland?
Right. Sandra Bland was a young lady who was African-American who had studied at Prairie View A&M and moved back to Chicago, where she was from. And then she was offered a job by the same university that educated her. So on her way back, in fact, very close to the university, right in the outskirts of Houston, she was pulled over by a trooper who essentially, instead of de-escalating the situation, escalated it, ended up arresting her for something that really shouldn't have been an arrestable act. And then consequently, she committed suicide 24 hours after being committed to the jail.
Mm.
Dr. Del Carmen, following the death by police of Michael Brown, the Department of Justice investigation found that Ferguson police conducted stops and arrests that violate the Constitution, frequently stopping people without reasonable suspicion or arresting them without probable cause. 85% of the traffic stops, 90% of tickets, 93% of arrests were African Americans, which is a much higher proportion based on population. Interpret that DOJ finding and what was the lesson to be learned.
Right. So I actually work very closely with the Justice Department, and I've worked with them in the past in the New Orleans consent decree, and currently on the Puerto Rico police reform case, where I serve as a special master for the federal judge there. And I can tell you their work is very thorough. They're very, very bright attorneys that work for the Civil Rights Division of DOJ. And essentially what they found here is they found that there's a disproportionate percentage of African Americans that were stopped and searched, right? So for me, and I can tell you I've been doing this for 22 years, and I train all the chiefs of police in Texas on racial profiling. And one of the things that I can tell you with some degree of confirmation is that the key to understanding whether racial profiling is taking place or not has to do with searches, right? When police officers search individuals at a disproportionate rate and the subsequent component of that search is that they do not find contraband, that is in fact concerning. And so I think the DOJ investigation relates to that, which is a great point and something that we need to pay attention to across the board.
Dr. Del Carmen, in your opinion, what will the impact of George Floyd's death be on the future of law enforcement?
Yeah, I would say incredibly unprecedented. I think what we are seeing right now is history unfolding, and I can only compare it to the Civil Rights Act, right, in the sense that, we're seeing a movement across the United States that's sort of been creeping up from time to time. We've seen the protests, but this one is different. In my view, what the death of George Floyd has done is he has made the unbelievable believable in the eyes of many Americans. People that typically find a but or an if when it comes to police use of force, I think they have to pause and say, oh my gosh, I've been watching 9 minutes of this man slowly dying, an innocent man, in the hands or knees, in this case, of a police officer for no justifiable reason, so it can happen in the United States. Those of us that have been doing this kind of work for some time believe it, right? We've seen it before, but there have been many people across the United States that have never believed it. And I think this one is very different because there's no context to place on this. This is what's wrong. It was murder, and it needs to be addressed.
Earlier in the interview, you said, and I'm paraphrasing here, you said that some people simply should not be police. I remember a couple of years ago, I did a television story with a local police chief, and he made the observation that some of the problems that follow down the line start with the screening process. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think actually it starts before that, right? So I think it starts with the recruitment process before you actually even process him in as a candidate. If you look across the board, since Ferguson, law enforcement has had very negative feedback, because of the way it's been perceived, and people sadly generalize and they think all police officers, are the way that some of them are, right? So when you see something on TV, people say, well, all cops then are that way, and that's not the truth, right? But at the end of the day, that's had a very negative impact on the recruitment classes across the United States. And so some agencies have been desperate to get folks to join them, and they've lowered standards. They've looked the other way when it comes to criminal past, when it comes to bias behavior, social media exposure. And I think we're beginning to see the results of that, right? Even though this particular officer in Minneapolis have been around for 20 years. But I'm afraid that what we're going to see in the next years is going to be more of the same if we don't increase those standards and place education, background, screen them for bias, and various other things that should be in place.
And so I would imagine that would require more resources than most police departments have, correct?
Right. But at the end of the day, when you look at it from the standpoint of a lawsuit, I mean, look at Minneapolis right now, where people are claiming and asking in local government in Minneapolis to shut down the police department altogether. So in the context of a lawsuit, and I can't remember the exact phrase right now or paraphrase it, but the federal judge in Chicago said it best, right? If you look at the amount of money that the city of Chicago has actually settled for since the inception of it being a city until now for police brutality, it's actually twice as much as the federal consent decree that they're currently on. So at the end of the day, it's an investment for police agencies to put their money in this particular screening process, in the hiring process, so that they can actually hopefully deter these events from taking place and ultimately save lives, right? Because, there's no price to a life, right? So at the end of the day, we're trying to save the lives of innocent Americans.
So we just got a text from one of our listeners. Please ask about recruitment of ex-military police and the difference between military policing versus citizen policing.
Yeah, it's substantive, right? So, and we actually, have visited this topic in the past where the military typically is deployed overseas. The Constitution is not in place per se, although they have to adhere to constitutional standards and international treaties and whatnot, but not in the same fashion as the traditional conventional police departments are here in the United States. I think ex-military make terrific cops in the sense that they have, wonderful disciplinary components, history of serving our country, commitment to a cause greater than their own. So it's all wonderful from that perspective. But I would argue that there needs to be training, lateral training, as it is the case in many agencies, where they're actually trained to work with civilians, because it's a very different atmosphere, a very different theater, using military jargon here, a very different theater than the one that they typically operate on overseas.
And Dr. Del Carmen, we're almost out of time, but what about the community demanding transparency from police departments? What needs to happen there?
That's absolutely crucial. The community, the police departments have to come to realize, many of them, some of them already have, but many of them need to come to realize that they work for the community. And if they don't have any credibility with the community, they cannot be effective in preventing crime or reacting to crime. So that is crucial. They need to create civilian law enforcement boards where the civilian population is informed, and they actually work with law enforcement hand in hand in solving our problems.
And Dr. Del Carmen, when does your book, Racial Profiling in Policing, come out?
So it should be out in about early August, from what the publisher mentioned yesterday. And folks can find it in the kendallhunt.com website, but I'll be happy to send that to you all so you can post it on your website as well.
Great. Dr. Alex Del Carmen, Associate Dean and Professor of Criminology at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth, Texas, and the author of Racial Profiling in Policing. Thank you so much for joining us. We'd like to talk to you again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Okay, take care. This is KTRS, the Big 550.